Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Webinar Wednesday. My name is Dr. Hilda Billups, and I currently serve as the Director of the Webinars Committee for TACUSPA. You will notice we have changed the format for this webinar just a bit. For this webinar, we will recap Chapter 5, Supporting Students Who Have Experienced Trauma, from the book Cultivating Trauma-Informed Practice in Student Affairs by Dr. Tricia R. Shaka. Allow me to introduce our facilitator for today's book club recap, Josh Meredith. Josh joins us from the University of South Alabama in Mobile, Alabama. But he first started his higher education career in Texas as Director of Student Life at South Plains College in Levelland, Texas. He is now at South Alabama serving as Associate Director of Student Activities, an opportunity he found through his TACUSPA network after getting involved in the association. He was selected as a 2023 Thomas Moorman Fellow and served as chair of the Webinars Committee from 2023 to 2024. I'm grateful to Josh for his leadership of the Webinars Committee. He handed over to me a rich collection of resources and materials, which has made my work as a director much easier. Josh has both an undergraduate degree in business management as well as a master's degree in higher education and student development from Taylor University. Though he now resides in Mobile, Josh is originally a Hoosier from the state of Indiana. In his free time, he enjoys running, spending time with friends, and reading a good book. We are very excited to have Josh serve as our facilitator for this book club recap and are thankful to each of you for viewing this recap. I will now turn our webinar over to Josh.
Thank you, Hilda, for the introduction and for the opportunity just to lead this recap today. I do have to pause, and you mentioned being a Hoosier. The Indiana Hoosiers have a pretty big football game on Monday, the national championship game. So I've got to give a shout out to my home state and just say, go Hoosiers. Um, Today we're covering chapter 5 from a book written by Tricia R. Shaka, Cultivating Trauma-Informed Practice in Student Affairs. And for those who weren't able to join that are watching this YouTube video or watching this recap, I won't delve into the first 4 chapters. We've got rich discussions on those on our YouTube channel. But I am going to walk through chapter 5 and pose some questions so that anyone watching this can get a good idea of what the chapter encapsulated, and then have some questions to maybe if you're leading your own book discussion or simply reflecting on your own, some implications that you can take forward or some questions that you can ponder. So, chapter 5 was titled Supporting Students Who Have Experienced Trauma. And I really want to start with just how Shaka outlines or how the chapter is structured. She gives a great introduction, and then before diving into kind of what the chapter is about, supporting students, she does give 6 practices, but right before that, she has a really great little section on just framing our work as student affairs practitioners and reminding us, at least gave me an important reminder of what our work is and then what our work is not. Then, the kind of third section of this chapter was specific practices to support students. And she gave 6 specific practices: nurturing relationships, being present, addressing issues of safety and control, attending to the complications of disclosure, providing resources and support mindfully, and then number 6, holding space for growth, resilience, and recuperation. She goes on and discusses and writes about some of the complexities of supporting survivors, of handling difficult to hear and difficult to sit with stories, the complications of our own personal triggers, of uh, managing and navigating those. Had a really interesting, I thought it was really interesting, and this is the part of the chapter that really stuck with me, some of the complexities of mandatory reporting. And the maybe accidental forced disclosure of a traumatic experience if the student's not ready. And then concludes the chapter nicely with the discussion on mattering and creating campus environments for students that matter. So I'm going to walk through kind of each of those briefly for those watching, um, share with you some of the things that I underlined or made note of, and then end with just some questions. So, in the introduction and setting up the chapter, Shaka writes, in other words, our most powerful support can be as simple as how we show up with others and how we listen. The meaningful difference happens in those simple acts. She goes on, resources and kind of balancing resources and relationships. She writes, resources will always have a place, but the most fundamental work is that of presence and humanity. And we'll come back to that later in this section or in this chapter. The next section, sort of after her little introduction, is framing our work. It's titled Framing the Scope of Our Work, Supporting Student Survivors of Trauma. And really what she gets at here is addressing sort of the pseudo counselor role that many of us play in sitting with students, hearing their stories, guiding them kind of through their college careers. But she gives us a really important reminder in the bottom of this first paragraph. Because student affairs is a helping profession and many practitioners have training in basic helping and/or counseling skills, it never hurts to be reminded that we're not counselors unless explicitly trained as such and working explicitly that way with a student in a therapeutic relationship. So as much as we desire to help students, as much as we can do to sit with and hear their stories, and to form a relationship with them, unless we're explicitly trained as mental health counselors, um, that's not my job. I'm the associate director of student activities. I am not a professional counselor. And so while it's important that I develop relationships, I love how she frames this before diving into those practices and says, remember who we are, what we do, and remember for those of us who aren't counselors, it's not our work. And then she goes on, what does our work entail then? It's the everything else. Um, which I thought was funny that we're not therapists, but we also, recognizing we do a lot. We do a lot to serve our students. Um, and then at the end of this kind of section of framing our work, she writes, institutions can fall into the trap of dehumanizing students, so sort of balancing that relationship with kind of the structure and organization and processes and business of an institution. Institutions can fall into the trap of dehumanizing students as revenue streams or risks to manage at the expense of remembering there are real people's lives in the mix. And I underlined that part in red, specifically being in student activities and having events to put on and things to do and guiding students towards those things. One of the things that's important to remember is that these are real students whose lives we're shaping. And so while our event or whatever it is that your office does, while the process and the outcome is important, what's most important is that we are shaping these students to go and live rich, full lives after they're done with their time here at our institution. Then, after sort of framing our work, Shaka goes into 6 specific practices. And then at the end of each of these gives sort of some examples of each. And so um, she writes that these 6 practices she sees as cornerstones to our cultivating trauma-informed practice. So practice number 1 is nurturing relationships. Um, She writes that it's important that we're attentive to ensuring every student has the opportunity to develop trusting, empathetic, and validating relationships with faculty or staff, and realizing the challenge of that. Relationships, she goes on, aren't simply connected to student engagement and persistence. In the case of trauma, they are connected to safety, control, and recuperation and well-being, underscoring that we can get caught up in, okay, students have relationships and friendships and connection to us, and we love those key terms of engagement and persistence and retention. And while those things are a measure of something, what's most important is that, at least for those who might have experienced trauma, um, there's something deeper: safety, control, and recuperation and well-being. She gives some examples of nurturing relationships. Um, Number one is considering the breadth of touch points of particular staff with students and who is being reached out to or not. She goes on to describe, I underline this because I hadn't thought of this before, but a sociogram exercise to sort of map out relationships with students, in particular groups on campus. And then number two, investing in small efforts that go a long way, such as knowing students' names, pronouns, taking advantage of breaks during programs or trainings to connect with a student. So finding simple ways, remembering a name, that's something that I struggled with when I first began my career. And seeing a student and it's not just saying, hey, man, how's it going? But saying, hey, and remembering their name and connecting with that student can really go a long way. Practice number two, she writes, is being present and cultivating the space for students to share. So um, she writes that as much as we want to help students, uh, she writes, however, that is exactly what survivors are often asking of us, is to just sit with them and be with them through the discomfort that is already in their daily lived reality. So often we don't have, I mean, most often we don't have to solve. We don't have to solve it. We don't have to quickly offer whatever it is or say anything. Often what those who have experienced trauma need is just a safe space that we can offer to just sit with them so that they can share when ready. She goes on, that kind of presence is what allows survivors to feel held and part of the social order again. It is the antidote to the kind of isolation that she references two examples of Liv and Paige articulated earlier. And at the end of this, she gives kind of two specific examples um, for being present for students who have survived trauma. Number one is embracing silence. She writes, many student affairs professionals have some training in basic counseling skills, and the use of silence may be one of the most powerful in that toolbox. Silence creates space for others and takes us out of fixing and solving mode, which many of us can fall into, and instead into simply being present mode. I thought that was a really powerful reminder for me as someone who always has something to say and is never short on words. Embracing silence, asking questions, just sitting with students. And then number two, she says, listen to listen, not listening to respond, not making that quick note of, oh, they said this and I've got something relatable or something to share or something to help, but receiving all that they have to say and offer in that situation. I think it's something not outside of trauma-informed work. I think just culturally or in general, it's a really good practice to offer listening to listen. Listening to listen is instead taking in the information to hear it and understand it on its own terms without considering how we intersect it. I thought that was really powerful. Practice number three, addressing issues of safety and control. Um, yeah, there's a lot in this section, and I thought it was really powerful. Traumatic experiences have a way of retuning our stress response system, and the world can feel unsafe in amplified way, writes Shawcub. Because trauma often seizes survivors' choices and safety in the aftermath, survivors may become acutely focused on trying to control situations as mechanisms of self-protection. And for me, this reminded me kind of what we talked about in chapter 4, and that is that question that she really brought up in chapter 2. What else might be going on? I've seen it in my students, particularly in decisions about what to do and programming decisions and disagreements. Um, Asking that question, what else might be going on, and figuring, oh, maybe this student just needs a sense of control over the situation, right? Of safety and control, this thing that is their idea. They wanna see it to fruition and not have others take away their sense of safety and control, even in as something as simple as events and programming. So, what else might be going on? Um, she then got into a little bit on that I made note of because I really wanted to have a conversation with our book club today with others on their thoughts on this because I've been wrestling with this since reading and making note of it. Um, the issue of mandatory reporting policy. So uh, she writes, expansive mandatory reporting policies have the potential to re-traumatize survivors and recreate the kind of harm that was already inflicted in the original trauma. Um, Something I had not thought of before. Um, Understanding that mandatory reporting is there to to help students, to make sure they're safe, to make sure that they have resources, um, but not having thought of, how can these policies that are intended to help maybe have accidental, excuse me, side effects of harming students or continuing harm or re-traumatizing students. She gives some examples of how we can address safety and control with our students. Number one is ensuring there is choice and predictability. So, um, for a student disclosing something to you, if you're a mandatory reporter, you know, I think that's what she's getting at is they might have brought this to you thinking, they're safe, and then reporting that might take away their sense of control. I'm not really sure, but that's her first example here is ensuring there's choice and predictability. Number two is the use of content and trigger warnings um, for particular topics. She writes, we can't predict everything that could be triggering to a student, but paying attention to the things that could be, such as a clip from a film about sexual violence or reading about police violence towards Black people, etc., and letting students know in advance about the content can provide them with the choices, kind of back to that first point, the choice about when and how and where they want to engage with the material. So again, safety, control, choice, um, ensuring that they have a choice in the matter. And then number three I thought this was interesting and something that I've done a little bit of maybe unknowingly, but engaging in space audits, um, taking time to intentionally map out spaces that we engage with students. Um, how might this space comfort or cause discomfort? So in my office, I don't use these harsh white LED or fluorescent lights in some buildings. Ours are LED, but I have lamps and the softer yellow lighting um, intentionally to offer a safe, warm, inviting space for students to relax and yeah, connect with them. So I read that and thought, I've done that, but maybe not knowingly, or I wouldn't have called it a space audit. But so that's your third suggestion. Practice number four is attending to the complications of disclosure. So kind of again to what we just talked about, or just brought up of the mandatory reporting, um, and how that might lead to forced disclosure of something that they're not ready to share with others. She writes from her personal experience of how we can attend to students and help them piece together kind of a narrative or a story of what happened as a way to becoming more whole and having a better understanding of their trauma. Piecing a narrative back together can bring the solace of a better understanding of what happened. However, as much as survivors may instinctively work to reconstruct an account of what they have endured, she goes on, there are distinct complications related to this narrative building and ultimately narrative sharing. Being attentive to the complicated realities of disclosure, she goes on, writing about the concerns of appropriateness of should I share this or not share this? Um, and then she writes about, yeah, forced disclosure. She writes, this happens when a survivor feels like they have to share what happened to them, even if they don't want to. And it can happen in many innocuous ways in the college environment. Some of the examples she gives are health or like intake forms, or appeal policies in place for academics. So if a student is not doing well in a class and they are appealing a grade or a decision, um, how might those policies or procedures, while intended, good intentions, making sure that there's a requirement and you've got to meet that requirement to get a certain grade in a course, um, that appeal process potentially leading a student to have to disclose something that they're not ready to disclose, and that being a barrier to their success. So I thought that was really uh, noteworthy. She gives two examples of attending to the complications of disclosure, reviewing, as we just discussed, our appeal and application processes. And then she writes, when we're tempted to ask students details about why they need accommodations, so accommodations, pause to consider whether we really need to know and/or what possibilities we might be creating for harmful instances of forced disclosure. So really back to what she's discussed before, and that's being mindful and asking what else might be going on. Practice number 5 is providing resources and support mindfully. Resources alone, she writes, may not constitute what survivors need. And providing resources is a decidedly reactive stance to trauma. And then she writes, resources aren't neutral. So understanding that offering resources can implicitly communicate something to students. So she cites her own work of conscious referrals, and um, uh, by conscious referrals, I'm asking that before we connect students to others or resources, we first think about why and what the implications of those actions might be. So before just saying, hey, here's a list of things that you might, want to take advantage of, really being mindful of what that might communicate to students. She then goes on to write about kind of the balance between under-involved support and then over-involved or seeming over-involvement. Um, Sort of the balance of uh, being back to that earlier discussion of being more than what our role is, of offering something to a student when they might actually need a referral to the counseling center, to a professional, um, or not fully taking space to listen to a student and simply deflecting and offering resources, excuse me, um, before actually uh, having a connection or creating a connection with that student or just giving them space. Um, What are some examples of providing resources and support mindfully? Number one, she says, is just to ask. It seems simple, yet it's easy to forget when we're feeling difficult, charged energy when students have been harmed. Ask students what they need and what they want to have happen, and what they don't want to have happen. And then she writes, um, the second suggestion or second example is not just reactively providing resources, but proactively, sort of before trauma happens or before it gets to a critical situation, that students are aware and already connected to those resources so that if something does happen, they've already got those connections and already have that awareness built in. And finally, practice number 6 is holding space for growth. This was a powerful reminder for me. Holding space for growth, resilience, and recuperation. She writes, our work cannot rest solely in supporting students through the hard parts. It also needs to be attentive to their capabilities for recuperation, resilience, and growth. There is the possibility, she goes on, of not just returning to a previous baseline, but experiencing growth after traumatic experiences. By holding space for good things, we create possibilities for hope, and hope itself is a powerful experience. Um, Not just seeing trauma as you've got to get back to normal or you've got to get back to this baseline, but seeing people as whole and still possessing the capability for joy and experiencing the fullness of life. The example she gives to wrap up this sixth kind of practice is open up the possibilities to reconnect with the fullness of the human experience. So not just seeing it as a deficit, someone who has experienced trauma, but seeing them as whole people still with the potential to experience the fullness of life. And then number two, remind ourselves in our work with student survivors that they are more than their trauma. Their trauma does not define them, that they're more than their trauma. I thought those were very powerful things, or reminders, I should say. And then to kind of wrap up this chapter, the third section discusses the complexities of support. So kind of going back from those 6 recommendations, delving into some of the nuance. The realities, she writes, so this is part 1 of the section, difficult to hear and difficult to sit with. The realities of trauma being difficult to hear and difficult to sit with mean that, yes, we instinctively resist learning about trauma, but also that when we do learn about it, there is a psychological and physical impact. We carry these stories with us to varying degrees. Many student affairs practitioners talk about the challenges of leaving their work at work, which can be amplified for live-in student affairs practitioners with no clear boundaries between work and home. So understanding that receiving someone's story or listening to a student when they exit our office and that door closes or the laptop shuts and we go home, that the work doesn't always end there and it can be difficult to kind of draw that line or have that boundary between our life outside of work and our work. She also writes about the difficulty of personal triggers, and she defines triggering is when something that we experience, whether it's something we hear, see, smell, reminds our body of a previous trauma, and it's like we're right back to that original state of fear and anxieties in our body. And then she discusses the importance of kind of going back to the boundaries. There are, however, moments in which we need to be aware of creating the kinds of boundaries that help to preserve our own wellness, kind of going back to what we discussed in chapter 4, while ensuring students are supported in other ways. Tricky balance of supporting students, but also protecting our own well-being. Excuse me. She goes back to just the difficulties of mandatory reporting and discusses this idea of mandatory supporting rather than mandatory reporting policies. Working to nudge institutions and policymakers to blanket support rather than blanket reporting is something that I wholeheartedly endorse. So she doesn't just discuss it, she endorses this idea of moving away from mandatory reporting, which I thought was really interesting. And then finally, discusses this idea, writes about this idea of institutional betrayal, that if students have experienced trauma and they move through different supports or they disclose to someone and they don't receive the support and resources that they need, that they can feel a sense of institutional betrayal. Institutional betrayal, she writes, makes trauma worse as it represents an institution that should have done more to prevent harm and did not. I thought that was really powerful. and then writes that we're going to come back to this in a future chapter. So we will explore this idea of institutional betrayal more in chapter 7. And then finally, the way this whole chapter concludes is she writes about the importance of mattering. She gives the example of April and writes the clear message, although this is an example from an earlier chapter of um, faculty and staff going above and beyond to support a student who had been through something traumatic. The clear message was that students really mattered at April's school, and the way so many administrators and faculty held April as a human who they cared about uh, long after the immediate trauma was indicative of that. She goes on, this is where mattering to others is so consequential. Survivors of trauma need to know that they matter to others and people care, even when those people may not know exactly how to make the trauma go away or what to say to make things feel better. Survivors aren't expecting magic wands. What they often need are simple acts of being acknowledged as whole and human, mattering to someone. I thought that was a really powerful way. She writes a little bit more, but I thought that quote, I put it in big brackets and underlined it in red in my book because I thought that was extremely powerful of cultivating spaces where students feel that they matter, that being the baseline that undergirds all that we do. And working specifically for me in student activities, I try and instill that mindset, that connection, belonging, mattering, those things matter to, no pun intended, or to be redundant, uh, matter to students, that it undergirds their entire experience of finding a study group or finding a friend and having support, navigating trauma. Mattering is the foundation for all of it. So, some of the questions I have for you, if you're reading at home, leading a discussion of your own, what stood out to you from this chapter? Is there anything in here that was particularly powerful to you? I've shared some of the things that stood out to me, but what stood out to you? Um, Going back to the policy discussion on how might our policies impact forced disclosure idea of we want to support students and ensure fairness in our institutions, but how might those lead students to have to disclose something that they're not ready to disclose or to share? What does that look like at your institution or for higher education as a whole? What does that look like? How might we revisit those conversations and maybe change the way we do things? That idea going back to over involved, finding a balance between over involved and under involved, providing space to hear student stories while also maintaining that boundary. What does that look like for you? You know, if you're like me and you're not a trained counselor, how do you find that balance between building and developing relationships with your students that you serve while also protecting yourself and maintaining well-being and referring them to resources as needed? What does that balance look like for you? And then finally, my favorite part, mattering. How are you, specifically, if you're watching this video at home, how are you going to carry forward and create an environment where students matter? How are you going to contribute to that ecosystem at your institution? Or what maybe needs to change within your division or department to create that sense of mattering for all students, where all students know that they matter through their interactions with faculty and staff on your institution? So those are the questions I have for you. Thank you for watching this TACUSPA recap of Chapter 5 from Cultivating Trauma-Informed Practice in Student Affairs by Tricia R. Shaka. Please be sure to join us on Wednesday, February 11th at 12 p.m., where we will dive into Chapter 6 and move towards the end of our discussion on the book. So, Hilda, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you for letting me kind of lead today's recap. I think I went a little longer than anticipated, but I do appreciate the time and space to do so.
Thank you, Josh. We really appreciate you serving as our facilitator for today. And thank you to each of you for viewing today's webinar. I would like to emphasize one thought from Chapter 5. Hope is a powerful experience. Let us remember each of us has the privilege of being keepers of hope for our students each day on our campuses. As we close today, I have a few reminders. These links will be in the description of the video. Visit our YouTube website to view our webinar recordings. If you're interested in presenting or serving as a panelist for a future webinar Wednesday, please complete the proposal form. It's time for membership or membership renewals. The TACUSPA membership year runs from January to December. If you're not yet a member of TACUSPA, we encourage you to join us or renew your membership. Thank you for viewing one of our 3 webinar opportunities for January 2026. Last Wednesday, on January 7th, a leadership interview premiered on our YouTube channel. Please search our channel to watch the recording. Next Wednesday, on January 21st, we will premiere a discussion of an article published in 2024 in Student Affairs on Campus, TACUSPA's Journal, Living in the Ivory Tower, Stress and Coping Among Live-In Residence Life Professionals, on our YouTube channel. All premieres are set for noon. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great day.